Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to our third CQC webinar of 2025. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Dr. Claire Seaver, and I'm Chief Medical Officer here at the Well-Led Provider and Redmore Health. And today's free webinar topic is all about some practical aspects of CQC ratings and what the CQC ratings actually mean and how they sort of translated to real world examples. And we've created this webinar based on the questions and the feedback that you've submitted to us in previous webinars. So thank you for doing that, and please carry on giving us questions and giving us feedback, because we do actually look at it and shape all of the content as a result. So welcome. For those of you that haven't joined our webinar before, we record this webinar, and after the webinar, hopefully Friday, perhaps Monday, depending on how I get on, we will send you by email a link to the recording, which then also has a link in it to the slides. And that will come automatically to every single person who's registered, even if you haven't managed to attend live today. And that email will come from the Well-Led Provider. But it also appears on our YouTube channel actually first. So if you subscribe to our YouTube channel, then you can be the first to watch our recordings, and you'll even get notified when they come up. So no need to make notes or take screenshots. It will all come to you afterwards anyway. So what we're covering today, we were asked to tell you about, in Gabby's experience, what are the common fail points that she sees from providers during their CQC inspections, and also to give a bit more detail of what good looks like and what outstanding looks like. And then we'll go through some questions that you've submitted to us in advance. You're also welcome to put questions today in the chat and in the Q&A thing, and I will keep an eye on those and try and answer them as I go, or I might put them to Gabby at the end if we've got time, or if they're really good, I might even reply to you afterwards by email. So do feel free to contribute on the chat anyway. I'll then run you through briefly what we do at the Well-Led Provider, and then introduce you to the medicines management team, who will talk you through what they offer for practices and PCNs. And it's the medicines management team that sponsor all of our CQC webinars, and therefore make sure that they remain free to everybody who attends. So it's with great thanks to them that this series goes ahead for you. I won't spend too long introducing ourselves, but you'll meet Gabby, who is our former CQC inspector, who now works as a consultant, helping practices, PCNs, social care providers with their CQC compliance. And you'll also meet Gary if he manages to join in a bit. He was having some camera issues whereby his camera was on and he had the background. But
I still am.
You still are. So we might have Ghost Gary. Yeah. But Gary is our practice manager and leadership expert, and he'll be putting some of the questions to Gabby that you put to us in advance to have a sort of dialogue about those. And it's Mohammed that we got on the call today from the medicines management team. So I will hand over to Gabby now to take you through the main meaty bit of the webinar.
Thanks, Claire. Hi, everybody. Good to see so many people on the call after the long weekend as well. So yeah, let's get started. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the layout of the webinars that we do, but the first slide is always just looking at the data that we're able to capture from the CQC website each month, with the caveat that because this is the third week of the month and not the fourth week, this isn't all of April, but it's what's been published so far. And surprisingly, well, there's always a big difference between social care services and GP practices, but this month I was quite shocked at the difference between the two. So just 22 GP reports have been published for April so far, with none, unfortunately, no outstanding reports. Positively, only 2 out of the 22 had a requires improvement or inadequate rating, and the majority were good. So that is overall a very, very positive sort of data run for GP services. And then over in the adult social care, the residential and care home support services, we're seeing about, sort of an even split between the requires improvement or inadequate and the good, with 1 outstanding report. So if anybody, I know we've got quite a few social care providers on the call today. So if you're looking for, if you've got a team meeting coming up this week, or you're doing any best practice work, then head on over to the CQC website and make sure that you pull off the outstanding report for for a review, it's something we always recommend that providers do to learn from the most up-to-date and the most current sort of happenings across the CQC, is to read the outstanding or the inadequate reports as sort of the two ends of the spectrum, to see what the CQC are doing and what they're rating and how they're feeling about the different ratings. So if we move over to the next slide, we've got here, we're just doing a little bit more this year. We're sort of giving more of a live update of what's going on over at the CQC, and rather than doing a deep dive into sort of thoughts and opinions about how the CQC are managing things, we're trying to instead just learn some lessons from it ourselves and apply things that have maybe gone wrong or not so well at the CQC, see how we can apply this to our practice in our services and the day-to-day operations that we're doing. So you've probably all seen that the CQC issued an independent review of their technological systems. The review came out in March, so just last month, and it's done a very, very sort of extensive findings and provided extensive feedback into what happened with the technology or technological failures that we all probably experienced in some capacity last year. So sort of referring to the portal, the notifications, the registrations process for some of you on the call. We all felt that pain in some way, shape or form, and we now have an insight into what went wrong for the CQC and what they're looking to do about it in order to learn lessons, to drive improvement, and hopefully make the experience more positive for everybody moving forward. But what I thought would be helpful is if we actually apply some of their CQC lessons learned to the single assessment framework that they inspect and regulate. So the technological headline was that the primary cause of the failure was a failed organizational transformation. I'm sure we've all, again, had experience. We've been on the receiving end or the delivery end or the coordinating end of trying to get digital systems or new technological systems over the line and embed them to work well for our staff, for our patients, for our stakeholders, for patient service users, anything. We know that it can be a difficult process. So the headlines from the CQC were that staff and stakeholders didn't feel that their concerns were listened to, that there was a poor or low user experience, and that it was an overly complex process. So staff fed back that they felt that it was a very difficult or complicated process for them to follow. So in order for them to fix the problems, what they need to be thinking about, and they've sort of committed to thinking about, is engaging with and involving users both internally and externally. So having more of a dialogue with their internal workforce and you who are the external sort of stakeholders and partners that are using the platforms. Revisiting their governance processes to make sure that they're more robust, and then making it more clear with regards to roles and responsibilities. So we've linked these to the quality statements that make up the single assessment framework that you should hopefully all feel sort of quite familiar with now. And these are all from the well-led key question for obvious reasons. It's a well-led provider, and also all of the things that have gone wrong do lend themselves to the management systems. So when we look at learning, improvement and innovation, the CQC sort of want to see that you as providers are prioritising and supporting your staff and prioritising them to have time to develop their skills around improvement and innovation, and that you've got a clear strategy for how you're going to embed these new systems or embed these new ideas, and that staff are consistently encouraged to contribute towards these initiatives. And that you as leaders, you encourage staff to speak up with ideas for improvement, and that you actively invest time to listen to them and engage with them. And that there's a very strong sense of leadership and strong trust between the leadership, between the management team and the sort of your more operational workforce. So when the CQC are inspecting your services and when they're looking at how you are compliant with the fundamental standards and the quality statements, these are the things that they'll be looking to you for a response for. So what strategy do you have when you are rolling out new systems or new processes? What what sort of pathways do you have to ensure that staff can speak to you openly, that they can contribute their ideas, and that you are listening to them and then actively using that feedback in order to drive improvement. And when they're speaking to staff, they want to feel a very strong sense of trust between you and them. So so those are the sort of things that I'll be looking out for. We should hopefully all know about freedom to speak up, one of the new quality statements that came in under the single assessment framework, and there is a separate webinar that we did on that last year. But again, it's so hopefully you'll have your freedom to speak up policy, you'll have your freedom to speak up guardian or lead in place, and that you are demonstrating commitment to your workforce, that any concerns that they've got or any feedback that they've got is very highly valued, and it's all acted on and responded to in a proactive manner. And that when the CQC are speaking to staff, the staff say, very clearly and very confidently, yes, anything that I do feedback, it's listened to, it's used. I can see where the changes have been created as a result of my feedback, and I want to continue to give feedback. What you don't want to hear is staff saying, obviously, the complete opposite, which is that there's no particular channels to give their feedback. Team meetings might feel rushed or hurried. The one-to-ones that you have in place might feel sort of quite formulaic rather than person-centered. And even when we do try to speak up, or we raise our concerns, or we don't feel that something's working well, nothing is done as a result. So looking at how that element is managed. Partnerships and community. So, from above, the CQC have recognised the importance of engaging with both internal and external stakeholders. So the same does apply for all of the CQC regulated services and everybody on the call. It's what are you doing to engage with your communities and your partners to share learning that ultimately leads to continuous improvement across the service. And I know that we've spoken about this and we touch on this, very regularly in all of the webinars, and Gary and I had sort of more of a good conversation about this last time, about leaning on other practices, leaning on other surgeries, leaning on other services, picking their brains about how the inspection has gone, what best practice knowledge they've got, what resources they've got that you can lean on and that you can tap into. And that partnerships and communities is often one that, there's so much that can be gained from getting that one right, but it's sometimes one that can be seen as sort of more of a process and a tick box. So so hopefully you recognize the importance of leaning on your partnerships and your local communities. And then the governance, management and sustainability. So for obvious reasons, the CQC, they've recognized that they didn't have clear governance processes, but that is absolutely something that hopefully that we can support you to get right, and that you feel confident with is your effective governance processes, and in particular your accountability arrangements. So who does what, who's responsible for individual areas, for individual tasks, how do you all come together, how do you try and prevent duplication or missing of particular key areas, and then how do you communicate the achievements and the actions that have been completed and got over the line. And then we're thinking about implementing relevant or mandatory quality frameworks, looking at recognised standards and best practice equivalents. So again, that's very much a question that the CQC will be looking to the registered managers for, to the practice managers for, and to the leaders really. What are you doing in order to build up your best practice knowledge, in order to build up your skill set? What training have you done recently beyond the mandatory and statutory training that's required, so that you can then lead your team effectively and that you are using the most up-to-date and best practice guidance in order to lead and guide your team. So that's a way. So this slide is really hopefully just a way of demonstrating that the CQC have got it wrong. They've acknowledged that they've got it wrong. They've identified what they need to do to get it right, and we have then linked this to the quality statements. So if if any of you are on the call and you're experiencing difficulties in any particular areas, whether that is a technological sort of transformation or any significant change across your practice or your service, it can sometimes be useful to link that to the quality statements, use the single assessment framework as a way to help you understand what's gone wrong, what do we need to get right, and how can we then, what are the next steps that we need to take to drive improvement. So that's our March update for you on the CQC Way. So if we move to the next slide, we've just got some questions that have been submitted in advance. So these two we have covered, so we won't spend too much time on these, but somebody has asked, what are the key differences from previous inspection formats? So there's a link there for you that gives an update on the single assessment framework and what that looks like compared to the old way of working. And then how much weighting is there on staff versus patient feedback versus governance. So these are the 3 Ps that we often talk about on this well-led series, is looking at your patients or your people that receive care and support, looking at your stakeholders, so your partners, your internal workforce, and then your policies and your procedures, so your governance and paperwork. So we always try and encourage providers to think about the 3 Ps of a triangle, me making a triangle there, and so yeah, sort of feeling confident that you can got the 3 corners of the triangle sort of ticked off and that you feel confident in those areas. So there's no answer in terms of, there's no data in terms of this is on patient feedback versus governance versus staff, but we just try and encourage that you align all of your compliance and your governance together in line with the 3 Ps. And then the next slide is the sort of the questions that have led us to do this particular topic today, this particular webinar. So we've had questions about the most failed elements. What does outstanding look like? So those that are rated outstanding, what are they excelling in? And for each area, so each of the 5 key questions, what would be your number 1 top tip or recommendation for achieving outstanding? So that's what we're going to be sort of having a little bit more of a look into today. I think the main thing to point out is that in order for you to understand how the CQC are making judgments, and again, this links back to the previous slide, you need to understand what data they're using and what best practice guidance they're referring to. So they are continuously updating their website, their internal knowledge, on changes of legislation, looking at NICE guidance, looking at Sky guidance, and in particular, they are accessing information from the NHS GP patient surveys. They're looking at the social services adult care surveys. The fundamental standards and the quality statements are always driving the way in which they're making their judgments and the way in which they're regulating. The draft characteristics document that hopefully you've all seen, which gives a breakdown of what each quality statement looks like for each of the scores and each of the ratings. And then they're also obviously looking at your patient feedback, your stakeholder feedback. So speaking to the ICBs and your ICS leads, getting feedback from Healthwatch. And then they're doing the on-site work, which we spoke about at the last webinar, which goes, provides you details of what the on-site information gathering looks like for you. So the next 2 slides are basically, and we'll start with obviously this slide, but the format of these are the 4 regulations, so the 4 fundamental standards that, in my experience, we see the most common sort of areas for improvement in, but also what the data tells us. So when we read the reports that are failing, when we read the requires improvement or the inadequate, and we look at data that's coming through, such as patient surveys, we can see that these are the key areas. So we're going to start with person-centered care and also safe care and treatment. So regulations 9 and regulations 12. Some information here, so the green font at the top is some information, again, that we've pulled from different resources. You will have access to all of these resources in the final slide, so you will be able to yourself go away and have a look at this. But we can see from when we're looking at GP practices that there are some significant sort of fail points that patients are experiencing or that staff are experiencing. So we've got here the number waiting for over 4 weeks for an appointment increased from 1 million in February 2020 to 1.4 million in March 2024. So that links directly to access to services. We're thinking about safe systems there. We're thinking about equity and access, and we're thinking about how we're involving people to take ownership and to manage in a holistic and person-centered way the risks that they're facing as a result of potential ill health. Another sort of piece of information here is the number of patients increased by 10% between March 2016 and March 24, but the GP numbers have not increased to meet this demand. So again, we can see there that there's sort of a gap in resourcing and a gap in staffing and recruitment, but the impact that has on patients, again, links to safety and it links to person-centered care. Without the staff to deliver the appointments, to deliver that person-centered and holistic approach and have that one-to-one time with patients, the CQC will be looking at this knowledge and looking at the quality statements and saying, you know, what are you doing to get around it essentially, or to manage this as best as possible? So how are you trying to improve access to services for patients? How are you empowering patients to manage as much as possible, as independently as possible? So for example, linking in with other services rather than needing to see a GP. What technology have you introduced or are you planning to introduce to support patients to access their records or to request services outside of the traditional method of, you know, telephone appointments, for things such as repeat prescriptions? So how are you reducing the burden on GPs, but at the same time empowering patients to take responsibility and take ownership where appropriate for their own health and care and treatment? Do patients feel informed about how their data is being used? That's been identified as one of the barriers as to why patients don't always access the digital and technological sort of systems and services that you're introducing. So what are you doing to to support patients to understand that better? And then understanding who would fall out of scope. So by that, what we mean is, you know, we acknowledge it's all very well talking about using apps and using the website and filling out forms, but from a person-centered point of view, there will be many people in your local community, in your local area, that aren't able to use that. So what initiatives are you putting in place to support them? So people that, you know, don't have access to the internet, or maybe where English isn't their first language, or where they do need support to fill out forms potentially because of a learning difference or a learning difficulty. So yeah, so the first two areas that we think are the most common fail points are person-centered care and safe care and treatment. And the data shows us that things are going wrong, and the suggestions to improve, or the things that the CQC will be asking you, highlighted in yellow, are things that hopefully you will go away after this webinar and have a think about, speak to your, you know, your management team and your colleagues about, and make sure that you feel confident that you're doing as much as possible to not to eliminate those problems, because we recognize that, you know, you can't just miraculously recruit more GPs to help you, or, you know, you can't overnight fix waiting times, but there are things that you can do to manage the risks and improve the patient experience. And then if we go to the next slide, please, we can see that the final two out of the four most common fail points are Regulation 17, which is good governance, and Regulation 18, which is looking at capacity. So again, there's some data here that we've got access to, that we can see since 2016, so in nearly 10 years, the number of fully qualified GPs for every 100,000 patients has reduced by 15%, from 51 to 44 full-time equivalents, which is obviously, you know, quite a significant, that's quite significant data to be mindful of. The monthly number of GP practice appointments attended in England increased by 24% between February 2020 and March 2024, so from 22 million to 27 million a month. I mean, that data is absolutely phenomenal, but it does highlight the pressures that your services are under. And again, this webinar we haven't got an easy fix for it. We don't think, you know, that, you know, we're not saying that, but what we're trying to do is link it to what the CQC are looking for. So they will be wanting to ask you questions about your staffing. What are you doing to manage capacity? If you can't increase capacity, what are you doing to manage it? What are you doing to strengthen the quality of the workforce that you've got, and the quality in terms of the GP or the clinician's experience for working for you? So do they feel valued? Do they feel respected? Do they want to stay with you rather than, you know, seeing high staff turnover? How are you supporting them, again, to give feedback, to drive change across the practice? So these things we know just from best practice and from good guidance. We know that if we invest in our workforce, we're likely to see higher quality and lower turnover, and therefore higher retention. And with regards to good governance, you know, some of the the areas that we acknowledge that we need to improve on is reducing the workload between primary and secondary care and reducing the bureaucracy. So again, we haven't got a quick fix for this on today's webinar, but it's just something for you to be mindful of in terms of where we sometimes see the most common fail points is that partnership working between primary and secondary care. And, you know, when we look at outstanding reports, what we're seeing is that people are thinking outside the box, that they're taking initiatives that maybe other providers haven't thought of to go that extra mile to reduce the burden and to reduce the governance systems and bureaucracy in place. So I've put funding and pensions in red because that's not something we can talk about, and also not something that the CQC can regulate or inspect on. So they wouldn't be able to have an opinion on that. But it is that is something that's acknowledged as being a risk and an issue across GP practices at the moment. So, and then if we move on, so what we're going to do now, thank you, Claire, is we're going to look at the 4 ratings, similar to how we worked the well-led series from last time, from the 2024 series. What we've done is pull off quotes from services that have been published last month, so March this year, and I think, yeah, little bit February, March of this year. And we've looked at the inadequate, requires improvement, good and outstanding reports. And then more specifically, what we've done is pull out particular quotes or particular extracts from the reports that link to the 4 most common areas that we see that aren't working. So here, for example, you know, on the right hand side, we've got Regulation 9, person-centred care. We're looking at staffing, safe care and treatment, and good governance that we've just spoken about in detail. But we can see in real time, so in the last couple of months, that these are the areas that have been pulled up by the CQC for GP practices that have then linked to inadequate ratings. So an example that we can see at the bottom, there was a lack of oversight to manage staff inductions and rotas to ensure there were adequate arrangements in place to meet the needs of the service. So, for example, the CQC were told that the practice had closed the doors to patients on occasions due to being understaffed. Now, I'm sure there's more to that story. There's probably much more to that in terms of risk and decisions that were made and conversations that were had. But what the CQC have done is, because they've linked this to the inductions and the rotas, it does suggest that the management team, sort of the leadership team, the registered manager, whoever it is that's overseeing rotas, hasn't made the adequate arrangements in order to meet the needs of the local community and the population that they're working with. So yeah, just something to think about there. We can see that the CQC have picked up on numerous staff had not updated their training, and staff reported that they didn't have time to do this. We see this all the time for anybody that's been joining us for these webinars for the last 12 and so months. Training and time to do your training it's one of the most common things that we see. And that would link to Regulation 18 for staffing. It would potentially also link to Regulation 12 for safe care, and it would also link to Regulation 17 from a good governance point of view. And then another example is that the CQC felt they were not assured that the practice had processes in place that were robust or effective to keep patients safe and managed in a timely way. For example, results from blood tests were allocated to the GP who requested them, but in their absence, we were not assured that cover arrangements were managed safely. Now, Claire on the call might have some more insight into that, but yeah, from a fundamental safety perspective, hopefully all of you can see on the call why that would be a red flag, or alarm bells would be ringing from a safety perspective. You know, when we're thinking about adequate cover and we're thinking about arrangements in place for absences, we can't have test results or anything that ultimately leads to safe care and treatment sat and not being looked at. So hopefully you're all in agreement of why that would lead to an inadequate rating for that particular area. So if we move on to the requires improvement slides, we've got here some extracts from services with this rating that have been picked up on particular areas under the most common fail points that we've discussed so far. One interesting one at the bottom, the last bullet point, the CQC say they were provided with evidence to demonstrate that there were meetings with the paramedic and the practice team. So obviously for this particular practice, they needed to be working with the paramedic. However, there had been one practice meeting in 6 months, and the last meeting with the paramedics was in August 23. So this report was published this year. So let's just say that that the inspection was done late last year, sort of autumn or winter of 2024, we're looking at least then probably 18 months between the practice management or the practice meeting with the paramedic, despite the fact that they have recognised themselves within their own governance systems that they need to be meeting with the paramedic. So we don't know the ins and outs, but what we've got there is a situation where the practice have identified a system, they've built it into their governance, their ways of working, but then they've not done it. And that's when the CQC that's when the CQC starts saying, well, your systems aren't working. You've identified something that needs to be done, but you're not then continuing on with it. So is it that it no longer needs to happen, or is it that you're not meeting the requirements for your own service? So just some food for thought there. And again, some sort of the second bullet point, we're looking at staff training. They had equality and diversity in the DOLS and mental capacity. So again, from a fundamental, mandatory, statutory point of view, those are absolutes that your workforce need to be up to date with. So they've given that a requires improvement rating. And the next bullet point down, the practice reviewed the family and friends test. However, we found no evidence to demonstrate the outcome of the national patient survey had been reviewed to make improvements. So they're doing some surveys correctly, they're managing the family and friends test, but then other evidence that's coming through, so the national patient survey, they're not using. So again, it's with requires improvement, it's often, as it says on the tin, basically, that you're heading in the right direction, you're getting some of the stuff right, but you're not managing things holistically, and not everything that needs to be sort of overseen is being overseen. So it's always and that again links back to the 3 Ps that we've spoken about. So if we move on to good, again, we've got some information here. What we've done here is extract some information from the most up-to-date CQC reports that we've spoken about, but we've also taken some information from the well-led provider platform that Claire will talk to you in a little bit more detail about at the end of this, at the end of me talking. But there are some tools that are available on the well-led provider platform to support you with your staffing. So to support you with making sure that as leaders, you're working proactively with your workforce, that you're collaborating with them, that they feel that they are part of the process, that any sort of changes that you're making, any improvement initiatives are all being managed in a very cohesive and inclusive way. And so one of the particular tools that they have, that the platform guide you to, is the Robertson Cooper resilience tool, which is designed to help individuals understand and build their personal resilience. So after people have completed it, they receive a report that outlines their strengths and areas for development across these 4 key components that you see in the image on your screen. So looking at purposefulness, social support, confidence, and adaptability. So we've just included that there because there are so many tools out there. We appreciate that there's so much best practice guidance. There's so many management tools, strategy tools. Google is just absolutely overflowing with them. So we're just signposting you to one that we have from experience found that does work and can be helpful. And that hopefully, if it's done well and you then listen, you receive the feedback, you listen to the feedback, and then you look at how you can embed that into supporting your workforce, then it would ultimately lead to an improved quality, improved retention across the staff that you're working with. And then if we look at outstanding, it's actually quite a lot for outstanding, which was good fun. So the CQC, so again, I mentioned earlier that when we look at outstanding, what we often see is it's services that have sort of thought outside the box. They've gone above and beyond something that the CQC themselves might not, that we ourselves haven't thought of, but we can see that it's worked incredibly well for that particular service. So one practice, as an example, held a register of patients who were signed up to use the digital system, and they monitored its effectiveness alongside putting in steps to support the remaining percentage who hadn't signed up. So the practice held a register of patients living in vulnerable circumstances, including homeless people and travellers. It also focused on supporting patients with mental health needs and offered priority appointments to those experiencing poor mental health, with the practice nurse checking that these patients had attended their appointment and following up if they failed to attend. So I've included that because I suppose this is a good example of going that extra mile to understand what's really happening. When you're speaking with practices, they will say things such as, not everybody uses the digital system, or we know that there are some people that don't use it. But what they don't then do is you don't then do a deep dive into the detail. So who isn't using it? How do you know they're not using it? What are you going to do to help them either use it or find a workaround? And how are you then monitoring the effectiveness of your system? So what are the short, medium and long-term outcomes of the systems that you have embedded? And if they're not working, what are you going to do to change it? So it's all those questions that come after you've identified something that often take you from good to outstanding. Good is we've got a digital system in place. It's working for the majority of people. We do what we can for those that it's not working for, but we don't really have sort of a deep analysis of that. But for this particular practice to hold that register and then to manage it in such a way has ultimately led to an outstanding score in the quality statements that are relevant to that particular piece. And then we've also got an example here of the practice that tailored its services to meet the diverse needs of the community. And specifically, they'd created an online system for care home residents, which I thought was quite interesting. So close and positive relationships were held with community services, the aligned care homes and local primary schools. And leaders told us that resuscitation training had been provided by the practice to the children at the local primary school, and also that each aligned care home had a named GP to ensure consistency. So, examples again of recognising not just what needs to be done and what would be beneficial for people in order to improve outcomes, to support people to manage risks, to think about equity and access to care. So, from children all the way up to people living in care homes. So they've not only identified it, but they've actually then, gone out and done something about it. So hopefully that's clear for you in terms of how the ratings look and where the most common fail points are for you to think about. So if we move on to the last couple of slides before I hand over to the rest of the team, questions again that you submitted in advance. So one practice have said we requires improvement, who were previously outstanding. Is there anything we can do to encourage the CQC to return? Unfortunately, no. Can do. Sorry, question. Yeah, there's nothing that you can do there. The CQC at the moment are responding to risk rather than the previous way of working was that you'd know when they were coming based on your rating, and that's no longer how the single assessment framework looks. Whether or not that's going to change now that they're revisiting their way of working, let's see. I'm crossing my fingers, let's see. But at the moment, no, there's nothing you can do to get the CQC to come back. And so for the other question, when should we expect their return from March 2020? Again, there's no answer there. When I think I was reading a report yesterday, and I was reading a report yesterday, and they had their last inspection in 2016. So they're nearly 10 years in. They got good, and presumably there's been nothing to flag to the CQC that there's any risks. So they're living on a sort of sat on a decade, nearly a decade of a rating. So yeah, unfortunately, there's nothing you can do to speed that process up. And then the next slide, some more questions that we've got for you. So thank you, Claire. So how would you challenge the CQC report factual errors? So we've got some guidance from our January 2025 webinar about that. So where we've spoken about proportionality and inconsistency, but we've also got a webinar coming up in a couple of months in September, where we're going to have a guest speaker from a legal background, so we're going to be talking more about the factual accuracy process for you there. But if in the meantime you do support, then obviously reach out to us and we can help you with that. And then the last question, we're a group of 3 practices overseen by the same management and operations team. How would the CQC visits for multi-sites look like? Would it be 2 days at each site? Because from the last webinar we did, we spoke about sort of the average inspection maybe being 2 days on site. Again, there's no clear answer. There's factors to consider that the inspection team from the CQC will be thinking about. They may be able to do the majority of their governance, their reading remotely and prior to the visits, but they will still need to obviously speak to as many staff and patients and stakeholders as possible. They may be supported by specialist advisors and experts by experience, which would then mean that they spend less time on site because they've got extra people to lean on and experts in their area to lean on, and their findings before or during the inspection may warrant more or less time on site. So for example, if they do find things that they need to look at in more detail, that might increase the amount of time they spend with you. So it's not a clear answer, but there are some things that they would be considering to dictate their workload. And that's it from me. The next slide is actually just the resources, so where you will be able to access all the information that has sort of guided this website. And that's it. Thank you for listening. I'm going to hand over to Claire, and in the meantime, I will have a look at the questions for people and get back to you.
Thanks, Gabby. Actually, I thought because it's probably time, I wondered if Gary is in ghost mode, but he is actually there. If he could,
great, yeah.
There's 3 questions in the chat, Gary, that maybe you could put to Gabby.
Yeah, absolutely, and I've sort of 3 of my own as well. This is my sort of,
great.
I'm a cat moment, isn't it? If anybody remembers that sort of call that was on the internet a few years back. I'm going to, while I search for them in chat, I'm just going to ask you sort of a question of mine then, Gabby. You talked about governance and CQC inspecting on governance. I just wondered, is that clinical governance or business corporate governance, and how far do they dig into that?
So yeah, it's both. So because clinical governance, as the regulations, regulation 12 is much more about safe care and treatment. So and when we think about the key question safe, that's looking at infection control, medicines management, so your prescribing, your clinical audits that you'll be doing. Under your key question effective, they're looking at experience and outcomes for people. They're looking at access to care and treatment. So clinical, I would say, is probably more of a golden thread throughout the CQC inspection and throughout the way in which they're looking. When it comes to non-clinical, so the business side of things, looking at your non-clinical audits, your policies and your procedures, having leads or champions in different areas, looking at your workforce, those tend to fall under Regulation 17.
Right.
From just an overall good governance. So an example might be that if the CQC are inspecting and they find an issue with your prescribing, let's say it's a significant issue that's where it sort of leads to a breach, they would probably breach Regulation 12 and 17. 12 because from a clinical point of view you've not got it right, which impacts on the safety of patients. And then 17, because from an oversight point of view, from a registered manager or a practice manager point of view, you haven't identified that Regulation 12 isn't going well. So Regulation 17 is not always like the umbrella, and then everything else falls underneath, is the way to look at it.
Okay, right. And the questions in the chat that we have here. So how often would you expect to have practice meetings? That feels like a big question.
That's a big question, and I'm not going to answer that for YouTube to have forever, but it very much depends on the size of the service, what else you've got going on. So if, for example, you have daily huddles, let's call them, or you're having weekly reception team meetings and you're having weekly management meetings or fortnightly clinical meetings, you probably don't need to then have regular practice meetings, as an example. But if you work in a way where you're just bringing everybody together, all roles and responsibilities and you are just hashing through everything that's going on, they will be longer, but you may need to also have them more frequently. You might have team meetings where clinical staff come in for the first half and then they go, and then other staff come in, or do you know? So there's no right answer to that, and it very much is about what feels right for you. And the CQC, they can't dictate, they can't mandate a frequency. What they're looking for is the effectiveness of the meetings. So if you only have one a quarter, and then they speak to all of your staff, and the staff say, I feel really confident, I know what's going on, I understand, the significant events that happened last quarter, I know what the lessons learnt were, yes, we had this complaint, yes, we had this incident. If they're in the know, then it's obviously working. But if you're only having them quarterly and staff report back to the CQC that they've got no idea how things are, and they don't feel that they're engaged with regularly, and they don't feel there's a place to go to speak to their leadership team, then it's not working. So in order to answer your own question, I would ask your workforce. I'd go back to them and say, do we meet enough? Do you get what you need to out of these meetings? Do we need to make them more frequently or not?
Yeah, I'm absolutely right. I mean, the minutes and sharing them and communicating is as important. Thank you to Eva for that question. Paul Carroll's asked, do CQC look at Google reviews of GP practices? That's interesting.
Yes.
They do. Okay. All right, nice, easy answer.
Yeah.
And then we've got, it seems that CQC is not using an evidence table now. So can you just confirm that for Imran's asked?
An evidence table. I might need a little bit more information on that, Imran, sorry, in terms of what you're referring to. I think maybe the way in which the reports are produced. I think, Imran, if you're able to email that with maybe a little bit more of a specific, then I can get back to you.
Yeah, we'll do that. Claire, I've got a couple more. Shall I ask, or do you want me to stop, pause? Yeah, okay. So just going back to the presentation, Gabby, you were talking about the sort of working between secondary and primary care. How does CQC view if primary care practices push back on requests from secondary care because they're not funded, they're not contracted? How do they view that?
Fine. I mean, my answer from my days as a CQC inspector would be absolutely fine. It's really, really important to acknowledge what you can and can't do. So what you've got the resources for, the capabilities, the capacity, and you first, you have to focus on your roles and responsibilities before you then look to take on additional. So if you're not funded for something, or if you haven't got the capacity or the resources to do it, and if it ultimately impacts on the safety of patients, if it impacts on the well-being of your workforce, if it impacts on the overall sort of effective operations and running of your service, then I personally, maybe other people on the call thinking differently, and please do say so, I would say that's absolutely fine.
Right, okay. And then thinking of the staffing situation, and I know, some practices find recruitment so difficult. If you have staffing issues, but you have tried everything to recruit, you've got a great plan, how does CQC view that?
Again, fine. They can't, they're not there to judge almost like the future or things that, that could have, that they're out of your control. As you said, Gary, if you've got a very strong plan in place and you've done as much as you can, and the thing, it's just not working, it doesn't mean it won't work forever. But it just means at the moment it's not aligning in a way that you need it to. They can't sort of rate you, score you more like a lower score because of that, because you're doing everything you can to make it work. If anyone on the call is experiencing that, then I would definitely recommend that you get in touch. But yeah, ultimately, you're doing all that you can.
Claire, we'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. I'll have a look at the chat as well just to see.
Thanks, Gabby. I've put Gabby's email address in there for Imran, so you can email Gabby with a bit more information about the background behind your question. I totally agree with what Gabby said. With my sort of BMA GPC England hat on, safe working guidance is all about quality and safety, and the CQC were consulted about it by the GPC executive and are on board with it. So nobody should feel unable to say that they're following the BMA safe working guidance for fear of repercussions with the CQC. I'll very quickly spend 5 minutes or under actually just talking you through what we do at the well-led provider, or the well-led practice as we're known to our GP customers. So we have our services that we provide. Gabby can provide CQC compliance services, including mock inspections. Gary does a range of webinars, including ones on governance, which I assume is why he was asking that question. And we also have a piece of software to help you gather some of the evidence that you need for the well-led part of CQC yourselves. Thinking back to the 3 Ps, you need your policies, you need feedback from your personnel and feedback from patients. And the bit that we find is often lacking with providers is that feedback from personnel. How do you seek the feedback from staff, and how do you make sure you're asking the right questions so that the CQC then looks at it and says, yes, I can see that your policies that you put in place are actually effective because your staff are saying so. So if you use our platform, you can send out some feedback to your staff anonymously that we've curated with Gabby's help, that we know will tick all of the boxes under the CQC well-led quality statements. And an example of some of the questions that your staff get asked are on this slide here. Actually, it might be a bit grainy, or maybe that's just my screen. But thinking about the topics that we were covering in this webinar, one of the questions that we ask your staff is, do you find that your team meetings are regular and effective? So that's one way of then showing, if you have quarterly meetings, but all of your staff say that they're effective and regular enough for them, then that would back up your kind of evidence that you're doing the right thing in terms of your meeting frequency, given that there is no prescribed frequency of meetings that the CQC dictates. And what you would get out of getting that staff feedback is a bit of a report with some data. We all love data that tells you how your practice team are feeling, compares you to the average of practices that we have in our database. So you might be able to show the CQC that your staff are feeling good about everything, and actually their scores are better than the average of all of the scores in our database. And you also get to compare how you as the leadership team feel you're doing against how your practice staff feel you're doing, in case there's a mismatch. For example, if you think meetings are effective and regular enough, but then your staff don't, then you know there's an issue that you need to pick apart, which you wouldn't get if you were sending out a general survey to everybody. We separate those answers out for you. And then what we have is a library of expert guidance and resources and exercises that you can then go away and say to the CQC, look, we found a problem. Here's the thing that we're going to do to try and work on this. Here's an exercise, or here's a thing that we're going to read, and then we're going to discuss, and we're going to implement something new as a result. So you can show that you're genuinely making some efforts towards improvement. You're not just seeking feedback for the sake of it, or to tick the box with the CQC. So we have, for example, got some resources in there about how you might want to do your team meetings, how you want to run them, and what sort of roles, responsibilities, and accountability lines you might need in your organization, just as an example. And then we have our range of services that I talked about already, including some new workforce wellbeing workshops that we've just launched, which you'll get in the some more information about in the email that comes through with the recording and slides, including a little discount code. So do look out for that. Did it actually flick through? It did flick through. And we have a webinar that we're delivering with Redmore Health next week about the new GP contract PCN desk. So sorry for those of you that aren't in GP practices now. Given that it's on the 30th of April, I put that QR code there. If you want to scan it while you're watching the webinar now, that will take you through to the registration page so you can sign up for that webinar. On our next webinar next month on the 21st, will be all about the different kind of perspectives from stakeholders, if you like, practices, patients, partners, locum GPs, the LMC, a partner and a practice manager with an outstanding rating, just finding out what people think about the CQC and what people think about a practice's rating. And so I hope you find that one interesting and join for that one. The link, when you get the slides, you'll be able to click on, but you'll all get emailed the link anyway, nearer the date. I'll now hand over to Mohammed to take you through the medicines management team and what they do to support practices and PCNs who have kindly sponsored this webinar for us.